Welcome! So this is the first episode of TechTime, a new weekly series on this channel where I'll be presenting to you my top tech news topics of the week. Now this will be a fairly open choice, so whether it's some gaming news, the craziest smart washing machine that'll change all of our lives, or someone built a real-life Terminator, which to be honest, in our current times seems pretty likely. If it's interesting tech, it'll be on this show. So without further ado, let's get into it. So our first story today comes from Apple. It looks like we may be getting AirPower after all, possibly sooner than we all thought. So after first being unveiled quite some time ago alongside the iPhone X and the iPhone 8, Apple never updated anyone on AirPower, and in fact they slowly but surely removed all evidence from their website, leading a lot of people to believe that they had simply discontinued it. But it looks like that could be false. So recently, a company from China called Charger Labs claimed to have spoken to two of Apple's suppliers in China, one called Pegatron and the other one called Luxshare. Now both of these companies apparently claim to have started mass production on AirPower. Now if this is true, of course, for one it means that Apple fixed the issues they had designing it, otherwise they wouldn't be producing it now, but also since it's mass production, it could mean that we'll be getting the product fairly soon. In fact, according to Apple's analyst Ming-Chi Kuo, who has been pretty accurate in the past as you might know, he says that if these rumors are to be true, he thinks we might be getting AirPower as soon as early 2019, so just a few more months to go. Now this obviously sounds pretty cool, but what I want to know from you guys is, are you still interested in AirPower? Honestly, it's been quite some time since it first was unveiled, and if it does get released, knowing Apple, the price will probably be pretty high. So will you buy it? Are you interested in it? Or do you think that it's simply not worth the wait and also not worth the money? Let me know down in the comments below. So our next story comes from one of Apple's key competitors, Samsung, and their possible plan for making a foldable smartphone. So these foldable or flexible smartphones seem to be the future, whether we like it or not. First we had these crude but technically functioning prototypes from Chinese companies, and then Samsung unveiled their first prototype for a flexible smartphone at their Unpacked event in 2018. And then also Google announced that to prevent further fragmentation in Android, they would be supporting folding smartphones natively. Now the first prototypes we saw from Samsung were very much that, they were prototypes. But it looks like at the Samsung Galaxy S10 event on February 20th, we could be getting some more information. So these sources are claiming that next to the obvious Galaxy S10 on its own event, we'll also be getting either more information on the foldable phone from Samsung, or possibly even a finished device that we can look at and get information ourselves from. Now we've also gotten some possible information about the hardware in this hypothetical phone. So a German source called All About Samsung, which have previously predicted some accurate information about Samsung phones, well they're claiming a few things about the hardware in this phone. So first of all, they're saying that if it comes out, it'll have a 4400 mAh battery. This sounds big, but to be honest, if you think about the fact that it has two screens, one being fairly large for a phone, this could be a bit on the small side. Then again, it's a new technology and basically they're cramming a lot of new tech into the same space as before, so I guess a smaller battery was to be expected. The more interesting thing, or the more positive thing I guess, is that this phone could be one of the first, alongside the S10, to have a full 12 gigs of RAM in an Android phone. And the other thing, and this could be useful on this bigger screen form factor, would be that Samsung might be providing an optional 1TB of onboard storage. Previously, of course, you could upgrade the storage for yourself using a microSD card, but getting an optional 1TB out of the box could be interesting for some users. Again, it might be usable even more on this bigger screen form factor. Next up, let's talk a little bit about CES that happened last week. CES is one of the biggest consumer electronics shows in the world, and therefore, or actually the biggest, and therefore it'll usually give you a good idea of what's coming in terms of technology in the next 2 or 3 years. Now this year, one of the biggest topics was artificial intelligence, which as a lot of you probably know is one of the biggest and also most developing topics in tech at the moment. Now different companies had obviously different approaches to this. Samsung seemed to have the most ambitious attempt, as they simply just unveiled a bunch of robots. There was no information on release dates, availability or pricing on these, but they definitely look pretty cool. Now the most attention was brought to something called Samsung Bot Care. Now this is meant to be some sort of a health assistance robot, and it can do things like help you with exercising and medical information, track and remind you of taking in your medicine, track your vital statistics and your sleeping patterns and then help you improving them, and finally in case of an emergency it can call your family or doctor for help. So next up in lineup we had this small little guy called Samsung Bot Air. This one has a much simpler task than the other ones. His job is to go around your home and clean the air. So basically rolls around by itself, and it finds and then destroys sources and, places of air pollution in your home to, I guess, improve your air quality. Now, how many people would actually buy this, I don't know, but again, it sounds like a cool idea. The final robot was something called Samsung Bot Retail. This guy was not meant to be used in homes, but more in shops to replace shop assistants. And the robot is taller than most others, and also it looks a little bit more humanistic than the others because it has a separate head. And its goal is to give you information and advice on the product in the shop. It can take you to the product and maybe even get the product for you using the shelving system on its back. And then finally, we saw something called the GEMS Aged Exoskeleton. This is not really a robot, but more of an assistant and, I guess, a wearable for humans, and its goal is to influence and aid the human movement. So basically, it can be worn similar to a belt, and uses for it could range from people recovering from accidents and maybe being in rehab for learning to walk again, and this belt could help you to learn it again by assisting you with walking. And then something else could be an athlete, for instance, who is trying to prepare for some sprinting or a marathon, and then using this belt he could then add or remove some resistance on his legs, and this is all based on AI, so the AI tracks your movement and then adjusts the resistance based on that. So there's no real release information on these yet, there's no pricing or release dates or anything like that, but if they do release it, I will make sure to keep you updated on the show again, because these products do look pretty promising. So next up at CES, a Kickstarter called Zoomy took more of an educational approach at artificial intelligence. So their Python programmable self-driving car toy works similarly to other robotics learning tools. It's meant to teach the basics of both programming and robotics. You can program it to do things like drive pre-configured routes, turn at certain points, accelerate to a certain speed, and stuff like that. The difference here is that the Zoomy car toy has a range of modular, pre-programmed autonomous driving abilities, which the user can add, modify, and experiment with. This includes things like self-acceleration, pattern and image recognition, and of course the use of different sensors on the toy to make those features work. So as autonomous driving is without doubt getting more and more important, and eventually we'll all own a car that at least technically can drive on its own, learning how it works is probably a really good idea. And doing it in a playful way like this, at least in my opinion, sounds like a really cool concept. And last, a simpler but still great concept is AI for home security. So smart security camera systems are nothing brand new. Companies like Nest have done these in the past, but the so-called SimCam Kickstarter drops artificial intelligence in form of machine learning into the mix. So using the Intel Movidius neural engine, it learns and remembers the faces of family members, friends, your pets, and also can trace objects that belong to you and are obviously important to you. That way you won't get false annoying notifications when, for instance, your dog jumps around in your apartment, or maybe your child came home from school. Instead, it only gives you an alert when an actual stranger enters your property or your apartment, and then gives you a few different options. Of course, you can record them and actually watch them live what they're doing, but you can also use the built-in speakers in the camera and the microphone on your phone to directly communicate with whoever is in the room and doing whatever they shouldn't be doing. Now, since the neural engine is pretty versatile, the SimCam can do much more than just simply home monitoring. You could, for instance, use it for normal photo taking, monitoring an elder or a child, and much more, as there will be an open developer API, so in the end, what you do with it is up to the individual developers. This is a more down-to-earth and simpler but still very promising approach to AI, as home security is always important, and I think it's a good place to implement such an interesting technology. So next up, I want to add one more AI story into the mix. This has nothing to do with CES, but it's still very interesting because it really shows in what different areas of life we could be using AI to make it more efficient and just generally improve it. So a team of researchers from the Northumbria University in Newcastle has now produced a study that shows how technically AI could be used to help solve previously unsolvable crimes, in this case, crimes that involve gunfiring. So I will link the entire study down among the sources, but the simplified version is that every time you fire a gun, something called gunshot residue is spread over your hands, your clothes, and also the surface around you. This basically is created from the cartridge burning the powder inside, so it's a mixture of burnt and unburnt powder, very fine and unnoticeable to the human eye, but it can definitely be traced, and police already use it to basically get ideas of who shot which gun where. But to analyze this stuff as a human can take a lot of time. So the idea is that an AI algorithm could do these pretty complex mathematical equations much quicker and also with much more efficiency than the human counterparts, and therefore it could possibly help to solve previously unsolvable crimes, because since these AI algorithms could analyze this gunshot residue to a lot more detail than the humans, we may need a lot less evidence to prove a certain crime to be true or to recreate a certain incident. Now, of course, this is a very specific case, but my point with these segments is to show that AI, which is a very broad and also continuously developing subject, can be used in all sorts of areas of life to improve us and help further develop. So next up, let's have a look at some gaming tech. Right, so at CES last week, AMD unveiled quite a bit of new PC hardware, starting off with the first mentioning of the new 3rd generation Ryzen 3000 CPU lineup. So every Ryzen lineup has 3 models, going from the mobile Ryzen APUs, which are Ryzen CPU cores combined with some Vega GPU cores, all the way to the workstation grade Threadripper CPUs. At CES, AMD unveiled their mobile Ryzen 3000 lineup. Now these still feature the last generation 12nm Zen Plus architecture, and they start off with a low power 3300U model. This features dual Ryzen CPU cores with a base clock of 2.3 GHz and similar boost performance clocks, so not much room for boosting, as well as 3 Vega GPU cores. The selection ends with the much more powerful 3750H model, which has the same base clock but much more room for boosting with a potential max clock of 4 GHz, and it also features 10 Vega GPU cores for some pretty serious video performance. The desktop variant of the Ryzen 3000s was only briefly demoed, with a supposed high-end model achieving similar Cinebench results to the current Intel Core i9 9900K. In the test on stage, the CPU managed to keep up with the Intel Core i9, but it drew much less power than that. So this demoed Ryzen 3000 CPU apparently had 8 cores, and was based on the much more recently released 7nm Zen 2 architecture. Now if that was true, it would suppose massive performance increases for all the Ryzen 3000 desktop CPUs. The chart that I'm going to show you in just a second originally came from YouTuber Adore TV, and it features supposed information about all the Ryzen 3000 desktop CPUs. Now the biggest news in this case would be that the top of the line Ryzen 7 model would feature a base clock of 5 GHz out of the box. Previously, this performance was only achievable on a few cores at a time, and also with some custom overclocking. So getting this clock supposedly out of the box would definitely be a very big achievement. AMD also released a new Radeon GPU. So it's going to be called the Radeon VII and is their first GPU to feature a 7nm production process. Still, however, it's not based on their long-awaited Navi architecture. Instead, they're using a 2nd generation of the existing Vega platform. Now on stage, the GPU showed an average of about 25% performance increase over the previous Vega GPUs, and it also drew about the same amount of power than those previous cards. AMD also showcased some gaming performance with the Radeon VII, so on stage the card was able to push the Devil May Cry 5 title, which is an update to the Devil May Cry series, to well beyond 60 FPS at 4K Ultra settings, which is definitely very impressive. So overall, AMD suggesting that the Radeon VII will be able to keep up with Nvidia's RTX 2080 at about the same price of $700. So Epic Games are going to be releasing a game selling platform, and this time it might actually be hurting Steam. So as some of you might have heard, Epic Games are in the process of launching their own platform for third parties to sell their games on PC. So first of all, thanks to Fortnite's massive success, Epic Games already have a launcher for Fortnite installed on millions of PCs around the world. And this already gives them a larger market share than any other game selling or launching platform next to Steam. So Epic are also advertising much more developer friendly rates when you're selling your games on their own store. So in Valve's case, you pay them 30% of your revenue from the game on Steam at first, and then once your game starts selling in higher quantities, you pay them 20% of your income. But that's still higher than Epic Games' cut, which according to them at the moment will be 12% regardless of how big your game is. So Epic are also announcing some quite interesting features for their new platform. For instance, they showcased a support a creator idea, where as a developer you can pay creators on Twitch or YouTube a small cut of the revenue of your game in return for them playing and advertising your game. Also recently, Epic announced their return policies. Now a lot of you might know that Steam has some very customer friendly returning policies, and, well, you guessed it, Epics are going to be very similar to those of Steam, so it might not be a reason for people to stick with Steam if Epic offer the same services. And our last story comes from Amazon. Now in the previous months we've been hearing more and more about the concept of a game streaming platform, similar to Netflix but for gaming. So technically this idea is great. For a fixed price, which obviously couldn't be too high every month, you'd be getting access to a big and growing library of games and could play as many games as you want every month which would be much cheaper than buying all those games outright. Now, the companies who offer these streaming services often also offer to do the game processing on their PCs and not yours. This has the benefit of you being able to play even the craziest AAA titles on a fairly old or just low-end PC, as all the heavy lifting is done off-site. Now, previously we had some fairly small Kickstarter companies who provided these services, and these companies just didn't have the hardware to process these games properly, so often the end user would have some lag on their PCs, and they just didn't have enough games for the users to pay the price they wanted. Now, Amazon, who are the current king of web hosting, as they have massive web servers that they rent out to companies like Netflix, Adobe or Samsung even, well, they are apparently planning to get into this game streaming market. Now, of course, thanks to this server system, it seems really plausible that Amazon could pull off the technical side of hosting and streaming the games, but also as they're just a very big company, it seems like they could have the buying power to get game developers to put their games onto their market, and then get consumers to pay the price every month as a library is big enough. So once again, I'll keep you updated if any more information comes out about this. And that was it for the first episode of TechTime. It's a new format that I want to bring to you guys as frequently as possible, and if you have any suggestions on what I could improve in the next episodes, make sure to tell me down in the comments below. Anyways, if you want to see more of these, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching and have a great day.